Picture a courtroom, not the sterile, fluorescent kind you see on television. An ancient one. Stone floors. High ceiling. The kind of room where the air feels thick with the weight of what and opos is about to be decided. There are two doors at the far end of the chamber. Above the first door, one word is carved into the stone, pardon. Above the second door, one word, rescue. Now here and opos. That's the question that has confused Christians for 2,000 years. Are those the same door? Most people would say yes. Most people use the words grace and mercy the way they use the words road and street. Close enough. Interchangeable. Basically the same thing. You and opos. VE heard it in sermons. You and opos. VE seen it on bumper stickers. You and opos. VE probably said it yourself. End quote. God is a God of grace and mercy. End quote. As if grace and mercy are just two synonyms for the same divine kindness. They are not. And the moment you understand the difference, the moment you see what the biblical writers actually meant when they chose one word over the other, something opens up in your understanding of God that cannot be closed again. This is not a video about theology for theology and opos' sake. This is a video about two of the most important words in the Bible and why the authors used them with what I can only call surgical precision. They never confused these words. They never used them carelessly. And once you see how deliberate they were, you will never read your Bible the same way again. We are going to trace four original words, two in Hebrew, two in Greek. The Hebrew words are chen and chesed. The Greek words are charis and eleos. Each one carries a specific weight. Each one describes a specific movement of God toward human beings. And the difference between them is not merely academic. It is personal. Because if you have ever sat in a quiet room and thought, I am too broken for God and opos' grace, this study was made for you. And if you have ever thought, I have done too much, gone too far, crossed too many lines, this study was made for you too. But we have to start at the beginning. We have to start with a man named Noah in a world that was about to drown. Genesis chapter 6, verse 8. It is one of the shortest, most consequential sentences in the entire Old Testament. The world has become violent. The text says the earth is filled with corruption. God looks down at what humanity has become and is grieved. The Hebrew word is yitoev, which means something like, in quote, pain grieved, end quote, a grief that goes all the way to the bone. And then, in the middle of all that ruin, end quote, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, end quote. In most English translations, that word is grace. In the original Hebrew, the word is chun, chet, nun, a two-letter root that carries one of the most beautiful meanings in the entire biblical vocabulary. Chen comes from the verb chanan, which means to bend or stoop towards someone in kindness. Picture a person kneeling down to look a child in the eye. That posture, that deliberate lowering, that is the image baked into this word. And here is what that means for Noah. He did not earn this. The text does not say Noah deserved grace. It does not say Noah had accumulated enough religious credits. It does not say God evaluated the moral landscape of humanity, found Noah to be the highest scorer, and awarded him chun as a prize. Chun, grace, is something that moves from the giver to the receiver entirely on the initiative of the giver. Stay with me, because this matters. When God looked at Noah in a world full of violence, he did not look at what Noah had done. He stooped. He bent toward one man. And out of that stoop, out of that divine lowering, came everything. The ark, the covenant, the flood survived, the world repopulate, and eventually, through the line of Shem, Noah, and Opos' son, the entire genealogy that leads to Bethlehem. All of that, from a two-letter Hebrew word, from a God who bent down. But chun, grace, is only one word. And one word is not the whole picture. Go forward in your Bible about 600 years from Noah. Go to the book of Numbers, chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. It is the most famous blessing in the Old Testament. God gives it to Moses. Moses gives it to Aaron. Aaron is told to speak it over the people of Israel. And it has been spoken over God and Opos' people in synagogues and churches for 33 centuries since. End quote. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. End quote. Notice something. That blessing has 3 lines, and each line pairs 2 things. Bless and keep, shine and be gracious. lift and give peace. The word translated in quote, be gracious and quote, in line 2 is chen, the same root as chun. God and Apos. S face shines upon you, and then he stoops. He bends. He extends chun. But notice what line 3 does not say. It does not repeat line 2 with different words. It says something different. End quote. The Lord lift up his countenance and quote. The image of God raising his face toward you, making deliberate eye contact, end quote, and give you peace, end quote. Two movements. Face shining and grace. Face lifted and peace. They are not the same movement. They are not the same gift. The Aaronic blessing is not being repetitive. It is being precise. And precision matters because there is something missing from these first two words, something that does not appear in Genesis 6 or Numbers 6 by name, but that is operating underneath both of them like a deep current beneath the surface of a river. We are going to find that word in the most unlikely place in the Old Testament. We are going to find it in a trash heap. The Book of Lamentations is not a comfortable book. Most Christians have heard of it. Few have sat inside it long enough to feel what it actually is. It is not a theological treatise. It is not a structured argument. It is a man sitting in the rubble of everything he loved, trying to find words for what has happened to him, and failing and trying again. The man is Jeremiah. The rubble is Jerusalem. The year is somewhere around 586 BC, and the Babylonian army has done what armies do when they want to make an example. The city is gone. The temple, the place where God was said to dwell, the place where the ark sat behind the curtain, the place where the smoke of 10,000 sacrifices had risen for 4 centuries, is a pile of scorched stone. Jeremiah is sitting in that rubble, and in chapter 3, he does something remarkable. He does not ask God for what he deserves. He does not present credentials. He does not argue his case. He says something that only makes sense if you understand the second great word we are studying tonight. Verse 22, end quote. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness, end quote. In Hebrew, the word translated in quote, steadfast love end quote, or in older translations, end quote, loving kindness end quote, is chesed. Chet, Samek, Dalet. 3 letters. And unlike chun, which describes God and Apos, S posture towards someone who has not yet entered relationship with him, chesed describes something that operates inside a covenant. Here is the difference, and it is not subtle once you see it. Chun, grace, is what God extends to someone he has not yet committed to. It is the stoop before the covenant. Chesed, mercy, is what God honors inside a covenant that already exists. It is loyalty. It is the keeping of a promise when the other party has broken their end completely. Jeremiah is not sitting in that rubble as a stranger asking God to stoop down. Jeremiah is sitting there as a covenant member, a son of Abraham, an Israelite, a man inside the binding agreement God made at Sinai, crying out not for grace, but for chesed, not for a new gift from a distant God, but for a faithful God to honor what he already promised. And here is what that means. Mercy, in the biblical sense, is not primarily about kindness to strangers. Mercy is about faithfulness to the broken. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus described chesed, in his retelling of Israel and Apos' story, as the quality that made Israel and Apos' God categorically different from every other deity in the ancient world. Every other god, Josephus wrote, needed to be appeased, earned, managed. The God of Israel had bound himself, by choice, to a people who would repeatedly break the terms. And he kept coming back, not because they deserved it, because he had said he would. That is chesed. That is mercy. And now watch what Jeremiah says next, because he is not done in the rubble. Verse 24, end quote. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in him. End quote. He does not say, end quote, I have figured out why this happened. End quote. He does not say, end quote, I have earned my way back. End quote. He says, God is my portion. The word end quote, portion end quote, is the word used for a soldier and Apos' share of the spoils, the thing he is owed by covenant, not by chance. Jeremiah is claiming chesed the way a soldier claims what his commander promised him. Not grace, not the stoop toward a stranger. Mercy, the fulfillment of what was sworn. Now here is what most people miss when they read this chapter. Jeremiah is sitting in the ruins of everything. He has watched children die of thirst in the streets. He has watched priests be led away in chains. He has watched the fire consume the house of God. And his cry is not, end quote, "Why did you let this happen?" End quote. His cry is, end quote, "You are still chesed. You are still my portion. Your mercy is still new this morning," end quote. That is not denial. That is not religious optimism. That is a man who understands the difference between circumstances and covenant. His circumstances are ash. His covenant is unbreakable. And mercy, chesed, lives in the covenant, not in the circumstances. But we have been in the Old Testament long enough. Because something happens when you cross from Hebrew into Greek, from the Old Testament into the New, something sharpens. The two words we have been studying do not disappear. They get translated. And the men who translated them, men like Luke and Paul, men writing in first-century Greek to Greek-speaking churches, they chose their Greek words with the same surgical care. The Greek word for grace is charis. Chi, rho, alpha, iota, sigma. It carries everything chen carried, but adds one shade of meaning that is distinctly Greek, beauty. Charis implies that the giving is pleasurable. God does not give grace reluctantly. He gives it the way a craftsman gives his best work, because the giving itself brings him joy. The Greek word for mercy is eleos. Epsilon, lambda, epsilon, omicron, sigma. It is the word used in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, to render chesed. But eleos in Greek carries an added visceral weight. It means compassion that moves toward misery, not pity from a distance. Movement. The feeling in your chest when you see someone suffering that will not let you stay where you are. Eleos is mercy in motion. And no one in the New Testament demonstrates eleos more perfectly than a father standing at the end of a long dirt road, watching a silhouette appear on the horizon. Luke chapter 15, verse 20. You know this story. You have known it since you were a child. Maybe the boy who took his inheritance early, which in the ancient world was the cultural equivalent of telling your father you wished he were dead, and then spent every coin of it on things that left him empty and broke and feeding pigs in a foreign country, which for a Jewish boy was about as low as a human being could go. You know how it ends. The boy comes home. But I want you to slow down at the moment most people rush past. Because Luke is doing something here with extraordinary precision. And if you read it too fast, you will miss the two separate movements of God packed into a single homecoming. Verse 20, end quote, "And he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him." End quote. Stop there. The father saw him while he was still a great way off. This means the father was looking, not glancing, looking. The kind of looking you only do when you have been waiting. When you have walked to the end of the road every morning for however many months or years it has been, and stood there, and scanned the horizon, and gone back inside, and done it again the next day. The father was not surprised by the silhouette. He recognized it. From a great way off, he recognized the way his son walked. And then, this is the word, he ran. In the ancient Near East, a wealthy man did not run. Running required you to lift your robe, which meant exposing your legs, which was considered deeply undignified. Commentators like Kenneth Bailey, who spent decades studying Middle Eastern village culture, point out that a patriarch running towards someone was almost unheard of. It would have been shocking to Luke and Apos' original audience in a way that does not translate cleanly into our world. The father ran. That is eleos. That is mercy in motion. The father sees misery, real misery, pigpen misery, came to himself and realized how far he and Apos, fallen misery, and the sight of it will not let him stay on the porch. He lifts his robe. He runs. He covers the distance between them himself, rather than waiting for the boy to finish the walk. Mercy does not wait for you to get all the way there. Now watch what happens when he arrives. Verse 20 continues, end quote, "and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him," end quote. The boy begins his rehearsed speech, end quote. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants," end quote. And the father does not let him finish. He cuts him off, not with anger, with instructions. Verse 22, end quote. "But the father said to his servants and Apos, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fattened calf here and kill it. And let us eat and be merry." And Apos, End quote. Here is the part nobody tells you. The robe was not a reward. The ring was not a reward. The sandals were not a reward. In first-century Jewish culture, a robe represented status. A ring represented authority. It was likely a signet ring, the kind used to seal documents, the kind that said this person acts on behalf of this household. Sandals were the mark of a son, not a servant. Servants went barefoot. The father did not give the boy what he earned. The boy had earned nothing. The boy had burned everything. What the father gave him was status he had forfeited, authority he had squandered, identity he had sold for a season of pleasure in a foreign city. That is charis. That is grace. The gift that is given not in response to merit, but in response to the pleasure of the giver. The father ran, eleos. The father robed, charis. 2 movements. 2 words. 1 homecoming. And now I need you to hold both of those movements in your mind, because there is a verse in the New Testament that puts them both in the same sentence, and most people read right past it without realizing what they are looking at. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16. End quote. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. End quote. Read that again slowly. The throne is called the throne of grace, charis. You approach it because grace is what defines it. Grace is the nature of the place you are entering. But what do you go there to receive? Mercy, eleos. You go to the throne of grace to obtain mercy. Grace and mercy are in the same verse, in the same sentence, doing different things. The grace defines the access. The mercy is what you carry out. This is not an accident. The writer of Hebrews, who was steeped in the Old Testament, who knew chen and chesed, who was thinking in Hebrew even while writing in Greek, is being precise. You come to God because he has extended charis, because he has stooped, because he has bent toward you, because his face is shining. And once you are there, in that throne room, what fills your hands is eleos, the compassion of a God who has seen your misery and refused to stay still. And this changes everything about how you approach God when you are suffering. Because most people, when they are in the worst season of their lives, do one of 2 things. They either stop coming to God at all, because they feel they have disqualified themselves from grace. Or they come, but they come small. They come apologetically. They come shuffling, the way the prodigal son shuffled up that road, rehearsing the speech about not being worthy of sonship anymore. But the writer of Hebrews says, come boldly. The Greek word is parrhesia. It means freedom of speech, confidence, the kind of approach that does not hedge and does not apologize. Come to the throne of grace the way a child runs to a father who has already started running toward them. Because the throne is defined by charis, and charis means the giving is pleasurable. God is not reluctant. God is not grading your approach on technique. God does not need you to be impressive before he will listen. He already saw you from a great way off. He already ran. There is a man who understood the difference between grace and mercy better than almost anyone who has ever lived. And he understood it not as a theologian with a library. He understood it as a man who had lived on the wrong side of both. His name was Paul. And before he was Paul, he was Saul of Tarsus, a Roman citizen, a trained Pharisee, a student of the great Rabbi Gamaliel, and by his own admission, a man who stood holding the coats of the people who threw rocks at Stephen until Stephen stopped moving. He did not stumble into violence. He organized it. He pursued it. He obtained legal documents authorizing him to drag Christian men and women out of their homes in Damascus and bring them back to Jerusalem in chains. He was, by his own description in 1 Timothy chapter 1, end quote, a blasphemer, a persecutor, and an insolent man, end quote. That is not background noise. That is the man who wrote most of the New Testament. And when you know that, when you hold that history in your hands, the way Paul opens his letters becomes one of the most deliberate acts of writing in the ancient world. Paul opens almost every letter the same way. Romans, end quote. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, end quote. 1 Corinthians, end quote. Grace to you and peace, end quote. 2 Corinthians, end quote. Grace to you and peace, end quote. Galatians, end quote. Grace to you and peace, end quote. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians. Every time, grace and peace. Not grace and mercy, grace and peace. Now watch what happens when Paul writes to 2 specific people, not to churches, but to individuals. To Timothy, his young apprentice in Ephesus, struggling with false teachers and a congregation that was fracturing under pressure. And to Titus, his delegate in Crete, trying to build order in a church that the letter itself describes as chaotic. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 2, end quote. Grace, mercy, and peace from God our Father and Jesus Christ our Lord, end quote. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 2, end quote. Grace, mercy, and peace, end quote. Titus chapter 1, verse 4, end quote. Grace, mercy, and peace, end quote. 3 letters, 3 times. Paul adds mercy. Why? This is not accidental. Paul does not add words carelessly. This is the man who argued in Galatians that a single word, end quote, seed, end quote, versus, end quote, seeds, end quote, changes the entire meaning of a promise God made to Abraham. He is not padding his greeting. Timothy and Titus are not just Christian readers. They are men in crisis. They are under pressure that normal church members are not under. They are carrying the weight of communities that are breaking. And Paul, who knows what it is to be broken, looks at them and does not just say, grace and peace. He says, grace and mercy and peace. Because they do not just need the gift they did not earn. They need the God who runs toward misery. And this matters enormously for you. If you are in a season where what you feel is not primarily guilt but exhaustion, not primarily failure but suffering, not primarily sin but pain, grace addresses what you deserve. Mercy addresses where you are. And sometimes where you are is a place that needs both. Pay attention to this, because this is where Paul becomes almost overwhelming in his precision. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. This is possibly the most compressed statement of the gospel in any of Paul and Apollos' letters. 2 verses, 3 theological words, and every word is doing specific work. End quote. But God, who is rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. End quote. 3 words. Eleos. Love. Charis. The sequence is not random. God is rich in eleos, rich in mercy, rich in the compassion that moves toward misery. Why? Because of his great love. Love is the engine. Eleos is the response that love generates when it sees suffering. It is the Father seeing the silhouette and already moving before the decision is conscious. And then, because of eleos in motion, because love looked at dead people lying in the wreckage of their own choices, what happened? End quote. By grace you have been saved. End quote. Charis. The gift, the robe, the ring, the sandals, the thing you did not earn and could not earn and will never be able to repay. The mercy is why he ran. The grace is what he handed you when he got there. And then Paul does something in verse 8 that strips away every last hiding place for human pride. He will not let you keep even a small piece of this for yourself. Ephesians 2, verse 8. End quote. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. End quote. Not of yourselves, not of works, not of anything you brought to the transaction. 3 negations. Back to back to back. Paul uses the triple structure deliberately. It is a rhetorical technique used in both Greek and Hebrew writing to slam a door shut with finality. He is not leaving a crack. He is not saying, end quote, mostly grace, end quote. He is saying, this is entirely from outside you. And then Romans chapter 3, verse 24. The legal language arrives, and it is precise to the point of being almost technical. End quote. Being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. End quote. The word, end quote, justified, end quote, is dikaiou in Greek, a courtroom word. It means declared righteous by a judge. Not made righteous. Not gradually improved. Declared. The verdict is announced. It is a legal status change, not a moral makeover. And that declaration comes freely. The Greek word is dorian, which means as a gift, gratis, without payment, by charis. Grace is the courtroom word. Grace is the verdict. Mercy is what carried you to the courtroom door. You see the pattern now. You see how these 2 words move together through the biblical text like 2 hands. One that reaches down and one that lifts up. Always doing different work, always operating in their own lane, always serving the same God who has refused, from Genesis 6 to Romans 3, to leave human beings where he found them. But we are not done, because there is one more place these words appear, and it is the place that changes not just your theology, but the way you will live tomorrow morning. There is a verse in Paul and Apollos' letter to Titus that most people have never preached a sermon on. It is not the verse you put on a coffee mug. It is not the verse that gets quoted at weddings or printed on bookmarks. But it might be the most radical thing Paul ever wrote about grace, because it does not just tell you what grace is. It tells you what grace does. Titus chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, and quote, "For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age." End quote. Read that again. Grace appeared. Charis, the gift freely given, the stoop of God toward the undeserving, appeared. Like a person arriving. Like a light coming on in a dark room. And when it appeared, it did not just declare something. It did not just pardon something. It began doing something. It began training. The Greek word is paidousa. It is the word used for the education of a child. It carries the image of a teacher who is patient enough to return to the same lesson as many times as necessary. It implies process. It implies that grace is not a moment that ends. It is a presence that stays. Grace saves you, and then grace schools you. This is the part of grace that most people have never heard, because most of the conversation about grace in modern Christianity is about what you receive, the pardon, the gift, the verdict of the courtroom. And that is true, and it is glorious. But Paul is saying something here that goes further. Grace is not just the gift. Grace is the teacher who came with the gift and never left. And here is what that means for the person who has been a Christian for 20 years and still struggles with the same thing. The same pattern, the same failure, the same returning to the thing you swore you were done with. You have not exhausted grace. You have not used up your allocation. Grace is not a bank account that empties. Grace is a teacher, and teachers show up again. But I want to come back to mercy one final time, because we have been following two threads through this entire study, and it is time to bring them together. Go back to the image we started with. The courtroom, the two doors, pardon above one door, rescue above the other. I told you at the beginning that most people treat those as the same door, and now you know they are not. Pardon is the language of charis, the legal verdict, the gift freely given, the robe placed on the shoulders of a boy who burned his inheritance. Rescue is the language of eleos, the Father who ran, the God who is rich in mercy, the chesed that Jeremiah clung to in the rubble of Jerusalem. But here is what I did not tell you at the beginning. Those two doors are not on opposite sides of the courtroom. They are not even two separate doors. They are the entrance and the exit of the same room. You enter through mercy. You leave carrying grace. Or perhaps it is the other way. You enter because grace made the access possible, and you leave with mercy filling your hands for the road ahead. The writer of Hebrews understood this. That is why he said, "Come boldly to the throne of grace." Charis, the access point, so that you may obtain mercy. Eleos, the provision for the journey. You are not choosing between two kinds of God. You are not deciding whether you need the pardoning God or the rescuing God. You need both. And the astonishing news of the New Testament is that both are available at the same throne, from the same Father, through the same Son who is, as Hebrews 4, verse 15 tells us, a high priest who is not unable to sympathize with our weakness. He is not unable. That double negative is deliberate. He is fully able. He has been in the pit. He has felt the weight. He has stood in the rubble. And from that place, from inside human suffering, he opened the throne room and said, "Come. Come boldly. Bring everything. The guilt and the grief. The failure and the exhaustion. The sin and the suffering. Bring it all. Because at this throne, grace handles what you did, and mercy handles where you are." Now I want to speak directly to two people before we close. The first person is the one who feels too guilty for grace. You have a mental list. You know what is on it. You have carried it so long it has started to feel like part of your body. The weight of specific things done, specific lines crossed, specific moments you would give almost anything to go back and undo. I want you to hear Paul and Apollos' voice in 1 Timothy 1, verse 13, a man who organized the murder of Christians saying this, and quote, "I was shown mercy," and quote, not because he deserved it, not because he had balanced the scales, because eleos moves toward misery, and guilt is a kind of misery. The God who ran down a dirt road for a boy who had wished his father dead, that same God, running the same direction toward you. The second person is the one who feels too broken for mercy. You are not in moral failure right now. You are in suffering. Life has done something to you. Loss, illness, betrayal, disappointment, so deep it has changed the shape of how you see the future. And you have told yourself that maybe you are too far into this darkness for God to reach. I want you to hear Jeremiah in the rubble of Jerusalem. City gone, temple gone, people gone. And the words he chooses are these. His chesed never ends. His mercies are new every morning. Not new every morning once you have recovered enough to deserve them. New every morning, before you have done anything, before the day has asked anything of you. New. The mercy of God does not wait for you to climb out of the pit before it arrives. The mercy of God meets you at the bottom of the pit. The mercy of God is, as the Father in Luke 15 demonstrated, already running before you finish the walk. And this is where grace and mercy stop being theological categories and start being the most personal words in the English language. Because you were not made to carry your guilt alone. That is what grace is for. And you were not made to survive your suffering alone. That is what mercy is for. Both of them. Yours. At the same throne. From the same God. Right now, we have traveled a long road in this study. We started in Genesis, with a man named Noah, in a world coming apart at the seams, and a two-letter Hebrew word that described God stooping toward one person who had done nothing to earn the stoop. Chen. Grace before the covenant. We moved to Lamentations, with a man named Jeremiah, sitting in the ash and stone of everything he had ever known, clinging not to what he deserved, but to what God had already sworn. Chesed. Mercy inside the covenant. We crossed into Greek, and found that the New Testament writers did not leave these words behind. They translated them. Charis for grace, eleos for mercy, and they used them with the same surgical precision the Hebrew writers used, never interchangeable, never careless, always specific about which movement of God they were describing. We watched a father run down a dirt road and understood that the running was mercy and the robe was grace, and that both happened in the same homecoming, from the same father to the same boy. We sat with Paul, a man who had blood on his hands, and watched him open his letters with grace and peace to churches, and grace and mercy and peace to individuals who were breaking under the weight of ministry. And we understood that the extra word was not filler. It was pastoral precision. We stood at the throne of Hebrews 4, the throne of charis, and understood that you approach it because grace made the access possible, and you leave it with eleos in your hands for the road. And we found, in Titus 2, that grace is not just a moment. Grace is a teacher. Pedousa, patient, returning, never finished with you. 3 things to carry out of this study and into the rest of your week. The first, mercy sees where you are. Grace decides what you become. These are not the same act of God. Mercy is God looking at your actual situation, the pit, the rubble, the pig pen, the ash heap, and refusing to look away. Mercy is the movement towards suffering that does not ask whether the suffering was deserved. And grace is the declaration that comes after the running, the robe, the ring, the verdict, the gift that rewrites your status from the outside in. You do not have to choose which one you need. You need both, and you were designed to receive both. The second, you cannot earn either one, and that is precisely the point. Chen was never about Noah and Apos' merit. Chesed was never about Israel and Apos' faithfulness. If it had been, Jeremiah would have had nothing to cling to in the rubble. Charis and Paul and Apos' letters is always paired with Dorian, freely, as a gift, without payment. Eleos runs down a road to meet a boy who has spent everything and come back with nothing. The moment you try to earn grace, it stops being grace. The moment you try to qualify for mercy, you have misunderstood what mercy is. Both of these move entirely on God and Apos' initiative. They come from his character, not your resume. And the third, hold this one, because it is the one that changes not just your theology, but your Tuesday morning. The throne of grace is always open, and mercy is always new. Hebrews 4, verse 16 does not say come boldly when you are ready. It does not say come boldly when you have cleaned yourself up enough to enter. It says come boldly, parrhesia, freedom of speech, No hedging, no apology, no shuffling, to the throne of grace. Right now, exactly as you are, with the guilt you are carrying and the grief you cannot put down and the failure you keep returning to and the exhaustion that has settled into your bones. Come. And Lamentations 3 does not say his mercies are new every morning once you have earned a new morning. It says new every morning, before the day asks anything, before you have performed, before you have proved yourself worthy of another day of chesed. New, every morning. That is the God of the Bible, not the God who waits on the porch until you finish the walk, not the God who opens the courtroom only to the qualified, the God who saw Noah in a drowning world and stooped, the God who swore an oath to Abraham and kept it through every generation that broke it, the God who ran, lifting his robe, undignified, already moving, while the prodigal son was still a great way off. That God has two hands, one extended in grace, one reaching in mercy, and they are both reaching toward you. If this study opens something in your understanding of Scripture, if you have never seen the difference between chen and chesed, between charis and eleos, this clearly before, then I want to ask you to do one thing before you close this video. Come to that throne. Not later. Not when you feel more prepared. Now. Because the throne is already defined by grace. And mercy is already waiting there for you to receive it. If this video helped you see God differently today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you do not miss the next study. Because we are going deeper into the original languages, deeper into the stories behind the text, deeper into the God who is more precise with his words than we have ever given him credit for. And if you have questions about what we covered today, about chen or chesed, about the prodigal son or Hebrews 4 or Paul and Apos, as letters, drop them in the comments. I read every one. Until next time, may the grace of God appear to you today as a teacher who never left. And may the mercy of God meet you exactly where you are, not where you think you should be, where you are. That is enough. You are enough to receive it. God bless you.